Hello, hello, listeners and viewers. Welcome to an English episode of Futucast yet again. It seems to be a new habit of ours. My name is William von der Pallen, and in Copenhagen today is Isak Rautio. Hi, Isak.
Yeah. Hi, William. This feels like I'm reminiscing about our Corona episodes back in the day. Like we used to have this remote setup a year ago, and now we're back at it again.
Yeah, it's fun to do one of these, especially today since we have a great guest. We're really thrilled to have Jamie Metzl join the show. Welcome.
Thanks. Thrilled to be here.
Super great to have you. Do you want to tell our listeners and viewers who you are and what you're, in your own words, what you're most known for?
Well, it's a tough question because, as always, my mother said, "Don't toot your own horn." But with a question like this, you have all these people who have now spent 1 minute in this podcast and are having to decide, should I stay here or go somewhere else? So let me try to give a little background and try to make it entertaining. So I'm a technology and healthcare futurist. I'm a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. I've written 5 books, including my most recent book, Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity, but also 2 sci-fi novels, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata. I'm a tech investor. I'm founder of the global social movement, One Shared World. I'm an Ironman triathlete, an ultramarathon runner, and I have a secret second life as a cacao shaman.
Wow. Even after all of that, you have a secret second life.
Yep.
Yeah. That is a very impressive litany of things to be. How did you do you have a story behind all of that, or what did you sort of end up wanting to be when you grew up, and how did you end up here now?
So I guess the story, maybe like a lot of people, is just an endless and boundless curiosity. And starting from when I was a little kid, I was always asking questions, why, and just exploring ideas to their logical limits. When I was in my freshman year of college, when I was 18, I met a classmate of mine who was a survivor at Brown University, a survivor of the Cambodian genocide, and was deeply inspired by his story. And that led me to go when I was 18 and work in a refugee camp on the Thai-Cambodian border. And seeing those refugees in this terrible condition, it made me realize, well, I wanted to do everything to help them. But the biggest thing is to look at this, to travel upstream and look at the superstructure of the world that was creating those kinds of problems. And that led me to work for the United Nations and for the United States government and the National Security Council and the State Department, trying to ask those big questions. And then when I was in the White House, my boss, Richard Clarke, was a person who later became famous for kind of being the Cassandra of 9/11, predicted it and tried to do everything to prevent it, but nobody would listen. And he always used to say, the key to efficacy in life is seeing around corners. And at that time, I really started to feel that the transformational technologies of the genetics and biotech revolutions were going to fundamentally transform life. So I started educating myself, writing about that. I testified before Congress. And I felt my messages weren't getting through. So I wrote my sci-fi novels. And when I was on book tours for those novels, explaining the science to people in my terms, I realized that the people had a sense something big was happening, but they didn't know the story. And so that was what inspired me to write Hacking Darwin. And then in that process, was recruited by Dr. Tedros and the WHO to be part of the WHO Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. And then through that process, and I didn't mention this in my self-intro, in the earliest days of the pandemic, looking at the available evidence, I determined really very quickly that while I didn't know the origins of the pandemic, I thought it was pretty likely that it did not begin at the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. And that led me to become one of the leaders of the world effort to call for a full investigation into pandemic origins and to raise the possibility of a lab incident origin for the pandemic. And so my work on that has been featured in most every newspaper in the world and elsewhere.
Yeah, it's super fascinating, and the main reason, apart from all these other good reasons to invite you, was I listened to your book, the Hacking Darwin book, and we realized we haven't actually made an episode about this. So in this podcast, we've talked about most everything, ranging from technology to, the future of most things, but we haven't really touched upon gene editing in that sense, and what it actually means and what it enables, but more clearly also the interesting questions around it, the moral questions. And as I listened to the book, it became even more clear to me how difficult the question actually is. So do you want to tell the listeners briefly what the book is about, and then we can maybe dive into some of the themes in the book?
Sure. So if people don't want to read or listen to the book and want to just hear the story in one sentence, I'll give it to you now, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the book. So the basic theme of the book and of this moment in human history is that after 4 billion years of evolution, our one species among the billions that have ever lived suddenly has the increasing ability to read, write, and hack the code of life. It's going to fundamentally transform every aspect of our lives and our world, and we're not ready for it. And we have to be, to make sure that these technologies, which have tremendous potential to bring a lot of good to help ourselves and the world, they could also do a lot of harm if we aren't careful and we don't make sure that we apply our most sacred values to guide the application of our most powerful technologies. I mean, that's essentially what the book is about. The book itself just lays out the case for why that is. It basically says that the genetics revolution is an exponential technology. It's not just genome sequencing, but it's the reading, writing, and hacking of the code of life. The applications, certainly people are familiar with the healthcare applications, the transition from generalized medicine based on population averages to precision or personalized healthcare based on each person's individual biology. But in that transition, we'll all have our whole genome sequenced. We'll have massive data sets of people's genetic or genotypic and life or phenotypic information. And then we'll use our tools of big data analytics to decipher insights from those data sets. And that's going to transition our healthcare from precision to predictive. And it won't just be predictive healthcare, but predictive healthcare, health, and life. And that doesn't mean our lives are entirely predictable or predictive. But certainly it does mean that our possibilities exist within a range. And knowing that range will enable us to work toward trying to function at whatever we perceive as being optimal. That raises huge ethical questions, issues of equity and diversity, and certainly exploring those needs to be at the forefront of our efforts. But this isn't just a story about human healthcare. It also is a story about the fundamental transformation and ongoing transformation of how we reproduce as species. We are, as I hope everybody knows, sexually reproducing species. But that doesn't mean that we need to, or in all cases even do, reproduce through the physical act of sexual intercourse. And more of us are having kids through science, through in vitro fertilization, and now through embryo screening called pre-implantation genetic testing. And that is going to increase. And as we understand more and more of human genetics, the process of selecting pre-implanted embryos is going to be super empowered by that knowledge. We are already beginning to use the science of stem cells, induced pluripotent stem cells, to increase the number of eggs in animal models. And I think it's likely at some point in the future that we'll be able to do that with humans, and that will radically expand the number of choices of pre-implanted embryos in the process of reproduction. The world's first, as far as we know, 3 CRISPR babies have already been born, babies whose genomes have been edited by a highly unethical Chinese scientist, Hu Zhonghui. But even though these first applications were really a disaster in many ways, this is a harbinger of where our species is heading. And again, we're not ready. And then beyond human health, these same revolutionary tools are in the process of revolutionizing and will continue to revolutionize broader fields, including food, agriculture, advanced materials, energy, data storage, and a lot and much else. And just to summarize the summary. Really, we're entering an age of biology, a century of biology. And so everybody needs to understand the biology and genetics and biotech revolutions, not because it's interesting, although it is, but because our success on every level in many ways depends on it.
Yeah, it's a rich subject of discussion because, it seems as if it divides into 2 distinct categories. You have the morally agnostic technology itself, and that would be an interesting thing to find out, what is going on within the scientific aspects of genetic engineering. What are the available technologies right now, and what is the future scope of them? But then I think the meat of the whole discussion is when these technologies start to meddle in human affairs, as it were. I mean, you also say this yourself, and other people have said this about other technologies as well, that we are beginning to wield the tools of the gods in some sense, and we need to update our perspective to that level too. And it's kind of said usually, but it's easier said than done. We have many very, very human games, and the civilization is very much still a human civilization, and it's not completely obvious how technologies like this will adapt. But I think it's worth underlining still, and you say this too, that this whole story about genetic engineering, this paradigm shift that's happening right now, it kind of permeates different narratives in human timelines than are accessible from the online news cycle. As you say, people aren't going to talk about who the president was in 50 years. They're going to talk about this being the turning point. Right. But yeah, let's get into I think the technology part is interesting first, to actually find out what is available now. How does gene editing work? It's not. I don't think it's a software where you just pick and choose and then something happens, some magic happens. There's actual science to it, which I don't think many people still understand. So where is the technology at this moment?
So a lot of great points embedded in what you just said. First, obviously, I completely agree. These technologies are tools. It's up to us to figure out whether these tools how they will be used, and whether they'll be used to advance what we hopefully consider as positive values, or whether they'll be abused in some ways that has the potential to undermine our humanity. But understanding the technologies is obviously pretty important. And so, as I said before, the tools are essentially reading, writing, and hacking of biology. So we'll start with reading. As I'm sure your listeners know, there are 4 what we call, it's a shorthand letters, A, C, T's, and G's in our genome, 3 billion base pairs. And so genome sequencing is our ability to read the code, just actually even to see what the code is. And that comes from decades of research. The first human genome was read in 2003 as a result of the international collaboration known as the Human Genome Project. Although that was for humans, there had been other genomes that had been read earlier. The cost of genome sequencing is going way down. At that time, there are debates about how much it costs, but I think $1 billion is a fair thing to say of what the first human genome cost, and now it can be done for $100. So that's a decrease much faster than Moore's law. It's highly exponential, and so that certainly ubiquitous genome sequencing unlocks a lot of other things. As a matter of fact, we're seeing it right now with the Omicron variant and just everything is our ability to sequence. But then following sequencing is understanding, because just getting a readout of billions of letters is only useful if we can make sense of it, and making sense of that is beyond the brain function capacity of any individual human, and so understanding that is it's connected to bringing together both our knowledge and the tools of AI and machine learning, and with that, then we're able to increasingly hack the code of complex genetics. And anyone who has an mRNA vaccine, you're a beneficiary of that, because we're just giving a new set of instructions to our cells to create a protein, in this case, the spike protein on the SARS, equivalent to that on the SARS-CoV-2 virus, that is just our bodies weren't originally designed to create. So reading is a big piece of it. And then there's the hacking. And so genome editing tools have been around for a while. CRISPR is the most well-known, but it's not the first. And the easy metaphor that people use, and it's oversimplification, but it's like a word processing or a molecular scissors, where you have a guide RNA. So we now, everybody I hope now knows what RNAs do.
Yeah, they can Google it.
Yeah. Well, just that you have these now mRNA vaccines in your bodies. So hopefully
you know what it is. Yeah.
So so basically the messenger RNA, it takes the instructions from your genome, which is in your cell's nucleus, to the ribosomes, which are in kind of the equivalent of the egg white, because that's the genetics is your genome provides instructions for your cells to create proteins, and so the RNAs are delivering those proteins. So in this case, the RNA delivers a molecular scissors, and you can just create an instruction. Here's what I'm looking for, and it'll be a certain code. And then with the CRISPR-Cas9, you go there, and then it makes on the target cells, hopefully, a double-stranded cut. And then when there is the cut, then the genome has its natural repair mechanism. So it'll either cut something out, it just repairs back with that thing missing. Or you can deliver a little snippet of genetic code, and if it fits, it'll just grab it and put that there. So it was better, faster, cheaper than anything that had come before. But already there's tons of innovations, prime editing, base editing, that are much more precise, that don't involve that kind of cutting. So genome editing is just getting better, faster, easier. Just in spite of all of our progress, these are still the very, very, very early days. So these exponential technologies are just going to get better and better and better forever. Right now, with the interventions, because our understanding of complex genetics is, even though it's much better than it used to be, it's still relatively rudimentary, and because our tools are aggressive, and because it's hard to make multiple changes at once, and we don't yet know what the outcomes will be. We're moving on a spectrum from simpler to more complex in our understanding and in our capacity for interventions. That's why there's a higher level of comfort in interventions in non-human life, whether plant or animal, and we're certainly seeing that. But forever, we're going to be moving along the spectrum with both greater understanding of not just genetics, but of complex systems biology, and a greater ability to intervene. And that is going to happen along all of the ways that I described earlier.
Yeah. How much do you think the fact that the mRNA vaccine has been so efficient and was delivered that fast, how much do you think it will accelerate the adoption of these kinds of technologies? Because I remember a few years ago already, when somebody talked about CRISPR and talked about these kinds of things. It was kind of the image in your head was kind of some random guys in a garage doing some. There's a good documentary on Netflix of some guys trying to solve HIV and stuff like that, and it seemed really scary.
Crazy guys.
Yes, and then you have kind of this, and this is the best and most efficient response. And we create something this quickly. So how much of a validation is it for this space, do you think?
I think it's a lot in two ways. First, just people have literally brought the genetics revolution into their bodies in a deeply personal and beneficial way. And so I think people just get it. That doesn't mean they know every detail, but they kind of get something big and profound is happening here. They get the mRNA vaccines are fundamentally different from the earlier vaccines, like the polio vaccine, which was a dead or attenuated virus. This is kind of hacking genetic code. So that's certainly one way. And then secondly, the mRNA platform itself isn't just about delivering vaccines. It's about delivering a new set of instructions to cells. And so the implications of that are huge. In healthcare, tons of work now being done on using mRNA platform to address lots of different cancers, HIV, TB, malaria, even dementia, and other things. There are agricultural applications. So it's just a whole nother mode of intervention. And that doesn't mean that everything is going to be delivered through the mRNA platform. But I think people are getting this broader principle that life is hackable. And the only evidence you need is that almost 4 billion years ago, there was a single cell organism or a few single cell organisms, and it morphed into all of life. So we know there's a lot of play within biology.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems as if we're beginning to traverse into the moral questions, relating to the applications in healthcare. I guess first of all, it would be interesting to know how efficacious is gene manipulation in stopping. We know this already. Do we know this already, that we can fix a lot of genetic ailments with just manipulating the genes? This might seem as an obvious question to some, but it's still I don't know if that's debated in medicine. And then also. Yeah.
It's these are the early days of gene therapies, and this is kind of the second round. In the first round, now almost 20 years ago, there was a lot of excitement. And then very unfortunately, one young man died, some would say was killed, at the University of Pennsylvania here in the United States, and everything came to a screeching halt. Now things have ramped up massively. There are real miracles that are happening in gene therapy, in CAR T therapy for cancers and other things. And in many ways, the mRNA vaccines, you could even call them gene therapies and not really vaccines, and like other vaccines. But we're in the early days of that. So certainly, there are starting to be people with single gene mutation, also called Mendelian disorders, who look like sickle cell disease, who look like they're being cured through these kinds of interventions. So it's really, really exciting. Lots of positive applications. Thousands, maybe now even tens of thousands of clinical trials. But these are still the early days for gene therapies.
Yeah, and as you say, this conversation is one of those conversations where it's very important to see around the corner. And you said that in the intro. That was very well put. This is probably going to advance much quicker than we realize. But what about so fixing diseases is one. One question about that is like, have there been any sort of side effects that have been discovered through these sort of gene editing things? It's hard to put into an example. I can't come up with one right now, but it's easy to imagine that manipulating a gene could have some unforeseen consequences on some other.
Well, if you not even necessarily
within
the wrong place. for instance.
Right. Even that, yes. But even like if you do everything right on paper, it might not even it might even have some unforeseen consequences to some other organism or some ecosystem at a whole.
Yeah. So it's a good question. I'll separate out the human and non-human applications. So in the old days, people used to think there was just one gene for one thing. Like there was a thing like, oh, there's a gene for that, the tall gene, the short gene, the fast gene, whatever. I mean, now everyone recognizes how silly that is. I mean, our genetics are a complex ecosystem that exists within the context of an even more complex ecosystem, which is our systems biology, which exists within the complex ecosystem of the environment around us, and all of those systems are dynamic. I mean, your underlying genome doesn't change, but and when it does, sometimes that's kind of scary with cancers and other things. But so this is really complex, and so that's why when making determinations about gene therapies for humans, there must be a very well thought out cost benefit analysis. And so when people are dying of single gene mutation disorders, and there is an approach that has the potential to save their lives or save their future children's lives, it makes it easier to have those kinds of interventions. But that doesn't mean that it's not without risk. I mean, there are sometimes these gene therapies work, but they're not. It's not a guarantee. We're still at an early experimental phase, and because we don't have a complete understanding of genetics or systems biology, that there are times when just making a change, even what seems logical and straightforward, could have unintended effects. And that's why this is not, you mentioned the Netflix series of these crazy people just doing, it almost seems like a willy-nilly DIY experimentation. We have to do experimentation, but it needs to be within structured environments where we are weighing the costs and benefits in regulated environments, in my view. But then there are a lot of things that are happening in the plant and animal world that are also regulated. I'll just give one example of efforts to breed cows, hornless cows, using tools of CRISPR, and it's certainly there's a lot of progress, but these experiences have shown that we don't always have complete visibility, and people do make mistakes, which is not an argument for shutting everything down, but it is an argument for being careful, because what we're talking about is life, and life, in my personal view, is sacred. All of life is sacred. Even single-cell organism life is sacred. That doesn't mean we can't or even shouldn't be manipulating life, and just that's what humans do, and we've done it through agriculture, domesticating animals, just living the lives that we lead. We need to do that thoughtfully and carefully.
What about then in the long term? We're now in the experimental stage, as you said, but looking like ahead, say 20, 30 years, and having the massive improvements in these technologies at the current rate that we have, what could be solvable in terms of diseases? Because as you said, there's still some debate on what's caused by what. And for instance, in cancers, there's a lot of things. To my understanding, a lot of cancers are to a very little extent based on the genome and the genetic factors, and quite a lot based on then the soil, so to say, the environmental factors. But so how complex is it to solve diseases as they are multi-gene diseases?
So on this, because I'm a futurist, I have to make claims. So what I will say is I'm certain that within 30 years, well within 30 years, we are going to be able to cure lots of cancers. Cancer isn't one thing, it's many things, but lots of cancers that we can't cure now. I'm certain of it. We'll be able to cure and to prevent lots of diseases that are death sentences now. I believe that we'll be able to extend healthy human lifespan. And again, using these technologies, using our understanding of the complex biology of people who age really well, of super agers, that's going to give us insights. That doesn't mean that the response to every insight that we have is editing the genome. It may be delivering a protein, it may be lifestyle, it may be all sorts of things, but this is a revolution. This is a revolution that's going to fundamentally transform our healthcare and the world around us. And 30 years in the exponential technology timeline is a lifetime. It was 6 years from when the seminal paper on CRISPR as a genome editing tool was published by Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, who later won the Nobel Prize for it. 6 years later, the world's first CRISPR babies were born. I mean, from a basic science paper to the first genome edited babies in 6 years. 30 years is a lifetime.
Yeah, that was intentionally a bit provocative in terms of the timeline, but one can only hope that, for instance, some cancers or Alzheimer's will be to the future us what measles or the influenza was to people in the past.
Yeah,
so,
I certainly believe that many cancers will be, and I certainly hope that dementia and Alzheimer's will be targeted. We've had a very difficult time here in the United States. We've had one of our first dementia drugs was approved by the FDA. It was really a sham process called Aduhelm. It doesn't really work. It's extremely expensive. The science wasn't convincing. So again, we need to be careful. We need to be thoughtful. But we are on a path toward developing these incredibly powerful tools that we will apply to making it possible for us to live healthier, longer lives.
It's an interesting, I think this is one example that illustrates how this sort of transcends modern human perspectives. I mean, it's not, we live in an age of reactive medicine in a sense. Like, as you also say, we go to the hospital with symptoms. But even in such a paradigm, it's not hard to morally argue for a proactive medical system. That kind of makes sense. It makes sense that we should be, if we're able to fix diseases before they even appear, why wouldn't we? But then when we start talking about improving humans, not even in any sort of disease sense, but in a human attribute sense, higher IQ, whatever sort of traits that are considered desirable or better in some in whatever context. That line seems quite blurry, and that when that moral argument starts to happen in practice, do you think about this? Like, I don't see this conversation happening right now, obviously because it's not available. The technology isn't happening. But do you think it might reveal something about humans that we don't really dare to admit to ourselves yet because we don't?
Yeah.
Have
So
to?
two good points. First, I completely agree with you, agreeing with me. That we're moving toward a world of it's not just predictive, but once we have predictions of a range of possibilities, it shifts what we now call healthcare, which is really sick care, into preventive care, where we know we have certain risk profiles and even opportunity profiles. And the way we think about healthcare is optimizing the benefits. And it could be simple things, which frankly everybody should do: diet and exercise, and but maybe even more complex things, or maybe we know we have a higher risk of a genetic form of breast cancer, and so we do start screening earlier. There's lots of proactive stuff that we can do, and certainly to your second point, when the issue of enhancement comes up, it scares a lot of people, and it should scare a lot of people. I mean, my father and grandparents came to the United States after the war. They were in Austria, and then they were displaced persons in Switzerland for 10 years and came to the United States in 1948. We're Jewish. So it's certainly clear from my history what happens when somebody has a crazy view of what's better and worse. And some people are considered on one side of the line, and other people are considered on the other side of the line. So we have to guard against those kinds of abuses. Having said that, we are already enhanced humans. So much of our lives are fundamentally different, not just from our ancestors' lives, but even from the lives of other people alive right now. I mean, people who have adequate nutrition when their mothers are pregnant and when they're kids, just have better brain function than people who don't. And there are lots of people in this world who don't have that. And shamefully, we're all too comfortable with those differentials. So what I always tell people, if you're worried about inequality in the future, focus on inequality now, so we'll know who we are when we get to that future. If we're perfectly comfortable with that differential now, it's almost absurd to be obsessing about some differential which will be probably less in relative terms than what we're talking about today in the future. But having said that, I do think that parents will want to make those kinds of choices. If your parents are choosing from among, let's call it 10 pre-implanted embryos in a lab, they're going to want, and if they have that information, they'll want to know, well, which of these pre-implanted embryos has the greatest chance to thrive, to live a long and healthy life. If they have other information about things like height and IQ, and which is entirely possible, likely even, many parents will want that. And that's why we need to have these kinds of conversations now about what we are and aren't comfortable with. And that's why I mentioned issues of equity and diversity. And diversity is particularly important in this context because diversity in Darwinian terms is random mutation. Think of the Darwinian equation of random mutation and natural selection. Random mutation is diversity. It's the driver of survival of all species, including us. And so limiting our diversity, even in the name of things which in our particular cultural contexts may seem as highly desirable, like a high IQ, or even like not being a recessive carrier of deadly diseases, could have a disastrous resilience consequence for our species. And that's why I don't think that's an argument for not enhancing. We are a species, a hubristic species that is always enhancing everything. It's the nature of our species, but we just need to do so wisely within a regulated environment guided by our ethics and values.
Yeah, it seems inevitable that once we can start choosing qualities, we will just go down that slope, whether it's slippery or
other
not.
people,
yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. Other people wanting it might make other people kind of feel forced to want it.
Yeah, kind
also.
of this game theoretic aspect of it, or one country
and
allowing
we,
it will allow.
And we already have that. Am I right about in Hacking Darwin about my Korean friends describing the competition with the test taking and plastic surgery and all these kinds of things, where everybody is getting plastic surgery as a high school graduation gift, and you don't want to be the person who looks funny, even though you look normal, and everybody is getting these tutors. China just banned special tutoring for kids because they didn't want to go down the Korea path, and lots of other countries do it. And so we live in a competitive context. It's the nature of our species in many ways. And that's, again, why we need wise regulation. But there's connected to my One Shared World work. Right now, we regulate on a national level, but the technologies that we're discussing here have implications on a international and global level. And so there's just a bit of a mismatch between what needs to be regulated and our ability to regulate.
Yeah, how capable do you think we will be to solve that regulatory and ethical problem? Because there's, as you said, there are different maybe views also between countries and people, and as this is a global problem, and looking at our track record of creating maybe, you know, global climate policies or global AI ethics, it hasn't been great so far.
Yeah. No, so I'm the founder, as I mentioned earlier, of One Shared World. If people want to go to the website, it's oneshared.world. And that's the problem that I and we have identified, is that the biggest challenges that we face are increasingly common and global, but we don't yet have a framework for solving that entire category of problems. And until we do, it's guaranteed that we will fail in addressing each of its individual manifestations, whether that's AI governance or climate change or proliferating weapons of mass destruction or pandemics. It's structurally guaranteed that we will fail to address those challenges. And the reason is because the people who we have chosen to represent us in these processes, namely primarily our governments, we've given them a job description of maximizing our national interest. And any national leader who announces that their job description is promoting the global interest will get kicked out immediately. I mean, we're here in the United States. It's the middle of this emerging Omicron crisis. We'll see what the studies show. And it's becoming clear that the third vaccine shot, what we used to call the booster, it's now looking like at least for the mRNA vaccines, it's just a 3-shot vaccine for efficacy. It's not 2 shots and an optional booster. But let's just, and so the US government has secured 3 shots and did it early on for everybody in the United States. But let's just say that right now, the president of the United States said, we've done the analysis and we think that these shots, that all of the shots that we have, either for people who've already had 2 or people who've had the opportunity to get vaccinated and have chosen not to for whatever ideological reasons, rather than waiting for those, we think that it's in our global interest to send all of those shots and all of that excess capacity to Africa, because this is obviously a global problem. I think that person would get kicked out of office. And we'd say, hey, wait a second, that's not the job that we hired you to do. So our leaders are failing us, not necessarily because they're bad people, but because they're doing exactly the job we've hired them to do and that we want them to do. And if we want to change that, we need to build an empowered global constituency of people who are calling on our leaders at all levels to just do a better job of balancing our narrower and broader interests. And that's what One Shared World is about. I certainly encourage all of your listeners to go to our website, oneshared.world, read our Declaration of Interdependence, sign the Interdependence Pledge, and you can support your country, support the United Nations, but I think we all should recognize that something more is needed, and we're going to get there one way or another. The kind of big 2 relatively recent shifts in how the world is organized. The first happened after the 30 Years' War in the middle of the 17th century through the series of activities that are collectively called the Peace of Westphalia, which established the foundation of what we now consider the modern nation state. And then through 2 world wars, we realized that a world just of competing sovereign states wasn't stable. And then at San Francisco and Bretton Woods and elsewhere created these international organizations, but still created, funded, and controlled by states. So there's this mismatch that I've described. And there are 2 ways we're going to realize this mismatch. The first and most likely is we'll not do enough. And then after a nuclear war or a synbio pandemic or an ocean ecosystem collapse or something else that would be the result of just continuing on in our current business as usual, we'll climb out of our caves and say, geez, I guess we need to build a new model. And that's the model of after the 30 Years' War, after the Second World War. Or we can learn the lesson that this pandemic is teaching us and say, let's try to solve these problems now within just with a positive attitude and say, well, here's a little lesson. The pandemic, as terrible as it is, could have been a lot worse. So what's the lesson and how do we learn it?
Yeah,
Exactly.
it seems the questions about the post-Bretton Woods world, they are very interesting because it is from this framework, it is hard to imagine what such a world would be like. And it's, I don't know, you mentioned a lot there, which would be very interesting to unpack. But I mean, there's this one thing. I'm just going to put this out there, and I don't know if you agree with this, but
Yeah.
But it seems the more we've enter this sort of international world and sort of global world and away from the sort of the destructive ideologies from World War II, we've sort of grown to understand our humanity as more socially constructed, more increasingly socially constructed, and less sort of biologically essentialist. Right. And that has led to this paradigm where we kind of consider everything that even is adjacent to biological essentialism as something like yucky, and we don't really want to have this part of our understanding of who we are as humans. And that is in some ways probably good, because that means I guess humans have to kind of taken our own fate into our own hands, and we understand that we can live together and whatever, and all these nice things. But this technology, circling back to genetic engineering, do you think that's going to reveal some uncomfortable truths that we're going to have to recognize to be able to live in this global world? And do you have
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm here in the United States. All around the world, there's, even for the best intentioned people, there's a little bit of conflict between the world, or even biology as we're learning it to be, and the world and biology as we would like it to be. And so, there's a movement here, and I know people quite well who are part of it, who just aren't willing to accept that genetic differences between people can be manifest in different ranges of possible outcomes. And I talked about my own family history, and obviously there's an intimate connection between Darwinism and Nazism, that the Nazis saw what they were doing as just applying Darwinism in their context. I mean, it was obviously monstrous and wrong. But now there just are genetic differences between people. We need to be honest about it, even though some people would like to say, well, everything is social. I mean, there's a reason why most of the 200 fastest marathon times are by people who come from a relatively small valley between Kenya and Tanzania. And it's not the distance between people's homes and people's schools. Here in the United States, this week, there's a transgender woman at the University of Pennsylvania who was on the men's swimming team in the first 2 years. And now she has been reassigned and declared her identity as a woman. And she's broken every women's record in swimming. And for those of us, I mean, I'm a progressive liberal, will say, well, everyone can be whoever you want. If she says she's a woman, she's a woman. But she's winning all of these races because she used to be a man, and there are biological differences between men and women. And so we're going to understand more about biological differences. That doesn't mean that we have differences. It means some are better and some are worse. But it means that we better know who we are. We better know what our values are. We better know what we mean by diversity, because the whole essence of diversity and resilience is you don't know what you need. If you had asked the dinosaurs, hey, you can genetically engineer your kids, what traits do you want? They'd say, sharp fangs, big roar, all those kinds of things. But it was the wrong answer. It should be like, how can you make us more like cockroaches and alligators? was the right. So we don't know there's no good or bad in evolution. There's just better and worse suited for a given environment, and the environments are always changing. But I do think it has to be values driven, because biology is telling us a lot.
Yeah, it's a terrific example with the transgender athlete, because I mean, on the one hand, there's nothing in science or nature or whatever that says that the social category of woman has to include a human organism with egg cells. There's or whatever sort of, that is something that has been decided by some taxonomical logic. But then that doesn't mean that the strata by which that determination has been made isn't real in some sense, and that is the relevant difference, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And like I said, there's the world as we get to know it. And there's the world as we would like it to be. And sometimes there's just a mismatch between those things. And basic summary is, I just don't think that we can bullshit ourselves in the name of our values. Let's understand the science to the best of our abilities. And then let's use our values in deciding what we should do with that knowledge.
Yeah. Maybe to round off and to kind of continue on this discussion as well, one part of the book I especially enjoyed, or a passage there, was when you mentioned someone at I think it was a conference, where someone stood up and told you that this is all too unnatural, that we should not do this. It's unnatural. And I think your response to that was pretty good and pretty accurate. So maybe to round off the discussion, we could talk about if this is natural or not.
Yeah, and who knows what's natural? I mean, is it natural that we're in different continents, speaking over Zoom through microphones? Is it natural that we do anything, eat most of anything that we eat, live the lives that we live? If you think natural means living like our ancestors lived before they had technology, and whatever we want to start with, fire maybe as that first technology, or stone weapons, or whatever it is, or like our ancestors, our pre-human ancestors, none of this is natural. So people who go to your supermarket and you get all your organic fruits and vegetables, almost none of that is natural, meaning our ancestors 12,000 years ago, before the advent of agriculture, they wouldn't have recognized any of that as even food. And so what we think of as natural isn't natural. It's just something that we're a little more familiar with than the new stuff. And I just think that this fallacy about what is and isn't natural can actually do real harm. And I'll use the case of genetically modified crops. I personally believe that genetically modified crops, it's a great and powerful technology that also has potential downsides. But none of the downsides, at least in over 40 years of research, none of the downsides of GMO crops are that they are unhealthy to eat. There's never been a single study ever anywhere suggesting that GMO crops are any less healthy for human consumption than non-GMO crops. There are issues of monoculture, corporate control, other kinds of things that are real and worth considering. But because people have this cockamamie view of what is and isn't natural, so organic fruits and vegetables that come as a result of irradiating seeds with massive amounts of radiation, that's what's seen as natural. And GMO or CRISPR genome edited crops that maybe are better in some ways or achieving similar results, that's seen as unnatural. Because of that, then we have all of these blanket GMO bans. And then people in the developing world and in poor countries for whom agriculture is really their best ticket out of extreme poverty, they aren't able to use GM crops like golden rice that could actually save lots of lives. And so all these people end up dying because people have this sense, GM feels unnatural, and I can't really participate in a debate. I can't really defend it. I just have a gut feeling that GM is unnatural. And again, I'm not saying that every application of genetic modification is good. I'm just saying that what we feel like, if the goal is, well, that we're going to have the test, that feels natural versus that doesn't feel natural. And if the standard is, well, compared to our ancestors 30,000 years ago, then it's like, well, I guess sleeping in a bed, that doesn't seem natural. Air conditioning, that doesn't seem natural. A refrigerator, having a baby in a hospital, ultrasound, because anything and everything. So that's why I think we need to get over that division as an organizing principle.
Yeah, I certainly hope that's not the mode in which we enter this new paradigm. Like, this is not, that can't be our sharpest critique.
No, I don't think so either.
No.
Listen, it's been a pleasure having you on.
Absolute pleasure.
I think for my part, I could continue for a long time, but we'll let you get on with your day. And if you want to read more about these topics, do check out Hacking Darwin, for instance. And if you have any other places you want people to find you on, now is your chance.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, the easiest place is just to go to my website, jamiemetzl.com, JAMIEMETZL.com. And there you can link to everything, my books. I've got all of my stuff on COVID origins. You can link to the One Shared World site. And then you can also follow me on Twitter. Same thing, at Jamie Metzl.
Perfect. We'll put the links in the description as well. But thanks so much for joining the show. It's really been my pleasure, guys. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jamie.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who tuned in for the conversation. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Stay safe, guys.